What inspired you to start Vendry?
Yeah, so I come from client side. I actually have no exposure from an agency standpoint. For me, my last stint was head of growth at a pretty sizable e-commerce company. And when you're running marketing, typically you're going to be hiring an agency at least once or twice a year, right? Something specialized is going to come up, or maybe you need an agency on retainer for a specific channel. But more than likely, you're going through the process. And so for me, it just felt like that being such a high stakes decision, bringing on the right agency can make or break your year. If you bring on the wrong one, it can certainly sink you. And if you bring on the right one, it can help you hit your goals. It felt like there was no resources out there to really enable my teams to hire the right agencies. And so as I was sort of taking a step back, I thought, why can't something like the recruitment or the headhunting model that so many companies leverage for bringing on great talent, why can't there be some version of that for hiring agencies? And so that's kind of where Vendry sprouted from.
And, before we even get started talking on the fun and the obstacles when it comes to hiring an agency, and this will be an interesting conversation because I come from the agency side.
Yeah.
Also do some fractional CMO work, so I see the client side. But before we get started, how does Vendry help streamline the overall process?
Yeah, so for starters, I think of us as a free resource for finding and identifying the right agency partners. So when you're doing a search, typically if you want to run a really well thought out search process, you should be talking to at least 10 agencies just because there's so many folks out there. You really need to understand what makes most sense for you. And so what we do is we take that like 10 plus agency searches. Generally speaking, we speak to about 20 agencies, I would say on average for each project. We narrow that all the way down to the top 3 for the client. So without even having to sit in on that 30-minute get to know you call, and no insult to agencies, I'm sure you do the 30-minute get to know you calls with all your prospective clients. There's a ton of fluff that happens there. And as a client, if you're doing 10 of those, that's 5 hours already right there without even getting into proposals or sort of digging a little bit deeper. So what we do is because we've already pre-vetted these agencies or have them in our network, we get the agencies to submit a lot of information relative to that specific project. We consolidate that information down into a short list of the top 2 or 3 agencies and then hand that off to the client and say, hey, you might already be chatting with a few agencies. Speak to these 3. It's gonna lead to a really, really nice conversation. And because the agency already has context into the client in their brief, that intro is a lot warmer. So they're not starting from ground zero. And I'll preface all of this by saying our service is free. So the reason we've structured it that way is we know you can run a search on your own. The alternative to our service is, hey, let me go try and find agencies on our own. And so we want to lower that barrier to entry as much as possible by taking a percentage from the agency, but offering our service to the client.
And I think that's really interesting because I don't want to say the biggest benefit, but the biggest benefit that I see to that is empathizing with the client. They are not always going to be a subject matter expert at Facebook ads or at email marketing or at, you know what I'm saying? It could be the business owner, it could be the CMO. And oftentimes they need to be more kind of widespread on their abilities instead of just being a very defined at that one thing. And the obstacle with that is that it can be more difficult to interview and vet employees or agencies to find the right people or the right team because you're not fully familiar with what is current best practice, if you will, for that channel.
Exactly. So I think you nailed a very, very imperative point to what we do. And to take that even a step further, yes, you might not be a Facebook expert. So how could you possibly evaluate an agency the right way? But taking that a step further, you run searches so infrequently, how could you possibly master running an agency search process if you're doing it twice a year, right? Say you were only running 2 podcast episodes a year, it would be very hard for you to hone your craft. So the same thing, as a company that's running, 10 plus searches a week, we have a process, we have the data to be able to mine through, and we know what to look for on behalf of the client. So you don't have to build that skill set, right? Because it's not valuable for most people unless this is something that you want to be building that skill around.
Yeah, and let's hone in on that a little bit. And that when someone is interviewing an agency or something like that, they may not have that subject matter expertise. Just from a high level, how would you recommend a CMO, a business owner, whoever it is, go about navigating the initial conversations with an agency to understand, are they just a sales team that also has a service that's going to be bad, or are they actually, experts at what they're doing?
Yeah, so there's two things that we sort of tend to derive insights around. So it's qualitative and quantitative data. So the quantitative stuff is, okay, what artifacts do you have to prove that you're really good at this? And the most important one for agencies is obviously case studies. And a lot of times case studies are published or they're readily available. But the benefit of chatting with agencies is there's a lot of data that they don't necessarily share up front that they can provide some insight around. And so just trying to dig into, okay, what is your experience here? And what tangible results have you driven for other clients that resemble my business? One thing that I often say is like, our clients, we don't need you learning on their dollar, right? There's enough companies in the world that like, if you want to, expand your agency's capabilities, do that with someone else's client. With our client, we want to find agencies that very, very much have that deep expertise in that specific channel, specific industry, in that specific problem that they're trying to solve. And so as a client, I would try and really build out as detailed of a brief as possible and say, okay, this is the problem that we're trying to solve. Not just, hey, we want to go run Facebook ads, but like, why do you want to run Facebook ads? What levers do you see as really helpful for your business? What blockers have you had in the past that you haven't been able to solve? And present that to the agency and say, okay, here's this problem. I imagine you've seen it before. How did you tackle this? And then what was the impact of that? And so that's the quantitative part of things. The second thing that I actually, my hypothesis around this has changed a lot since starting Vendry, and I probably didn't put nearly enough weight on this when we started, is there is a really large and tangible component to finding agencies around culture. So a lot of startups and high growth businesses, they spend a lot of time defining their internal culture and their cultural pillars when hiring employees. How do you find someone that's culture fit? Culture fit, culture add, people that ultimately build what you're trying to do. We don't apply the same thing to agencies, which is kind of weird given how deeply a really good agency integrates with you. And so one of the things that we try and do, and I would encourage companies to do as well, is try and assess from a culture standpoint how well you would mesh with this agency. And maybe they don't necessarily align 100% with your cultural values. You're going to be chatting with an organization that could be 20, 50, 100 people. So there's no way that you could mesh 100% with everyone in that organization. But ideally, they have the same philosophies as you do. And the specific areas I would hone in on are like communication. So how do you talk to one another, and can you find a shared language that would ultimately be collaborative and beneficial going forward? And then the second one, which is huge, is accountability. So how do you find an agency that shares similar beliefs related to accountability and find an accountability structure that ultimately works for you? And then in general, there's just like a sort of vibe that is hard to define. I don't necessarily have the language for it. And the word vibe has kind of become a little bit taboo or cliche, but you definitely know when you find an agency that sort of fits your vibe. I think companies are right to be skeptical when that vibe is with a salesperson because it's not necessarily reflective of the work. But if you do chat with an agency where you're speaking with a decision maker, someone that's going to be working in accounts, so whether it's like a founder-led agency or executives or media buyers, or just people that are going to be managing your account, accounting for how that relationship feels and assessing your intuition. Okay, can I work with this person? That is very, very important and not something to shy away from.
Yeah, and honestly, I think that communication is the most important piece. And I'll just address the elephant in the room with agencies, which is a lot of agencies can bring bad results. And in other words, there was when ClickFunnels was a huge thing, it was very big to, new client close, new deal. Let's be a sales team. And yeah, we also have a service, and that service might get some attention. So you were talking with the founder, and then you get passed off to a team of juniors, and it's not a good fit. So the ability to talk with whoever's going to be your point of contact during the sales process, and just understanding what that communication is going to be like, because on the reverse, not everything the agency is going to do, if they specialize, is going to be what's needed to succeed. Let's say they're a paid ad agency, there might need to be some landing page work done.
100%. And we talked about this a little bit off the top, but I think there needs to be an investment on the client's part in creating a really strong brief. So personally, I'm not a huge fan of the enterprise RFP process. A lot has been said about its bias that happens in the work that it makes agencies do, and the results are not always stellar. But one thing that I think companies get right when it comes to these gigantic RFPs is a lot of work is spent up front by the client to ultimately scope out what the project is going to look like and provide that perspective. And so I think one thing we do is, our first engagement with every client is a 20-minute call to build a brief together that we do send to our agencies. If a client is going about a search on their own, spend the time to build a document that ultimately outlines, okay, what are you trying to accomplish? Here's some context on the business. Here's everything we need, so that if there's something that's not within scope in your example landing pages, it's like, okay, there's the ability to opt out or flag that up front, so you're not wasting time going down a rabbit hole with an agency that ultimately can't fulfill everything you need.
And that's very beneficial for the agency as well. And, in the Sandler sales system, it's called upfront contracts, where the client's putting in some effort. So it's not like they're just kicking tires and, potentially just trying to get price quotes or ideas on what they could do themselves, right? So there's that added benefit for the agencies working with you, to where there's, I'm going to say not always, but more often than not, higher intent with the leads or the clients that are coming in. So that's a good thing. Well, we've talked about what to look for in the interview process. What about some red flags, right? Are there any type of red flags with agencies that you personally feel? And I'll throw one out there to start, and
sure,
I'm biased, but I think, actually I'll throw two out there and feel free to disagree. It can be troublesome if an agency does every service under the sun, because it can be difficult to specialize in something if you do everything, right? And most agencies aren't built with a pod structure. So you think you are getting centralization of strategy and communication. What you're more often than not getting is a project manager, and they're talking to different departments that all have their own ideas. Google Ads, Facebook, they're all in different areas. So that's one. And the second one, and this one isn't 100%, but project managers versus having the actual strategist or whoever's doing the work talking to you on calls, because what that can turn into is telephone tag, where you ask a question, they're going to have to go back and get that from the team. And what could have been answered and resolved on the call takes 3 to 5 days to be resolved.
Yeah, I love both of those. The first one very much resonates with me. That's something that comes up a lot is sort of this generalist agency. And I think overall, there is a really nice trend in the market of agencies starting to specialize and niche down, which is really, really beneficial for the client. And so I would say, to your point, avoid a generalist agency if possible, if you have a very specific scope. Now, not to say we don't work with any generalist agencies. They do come up. We've matched clients with them in the past. It takes a certain brief and client for that to make sense. For instance, if it's a client that is very exploratory in what they're trying to do, or maybe they do need a lot of hand-holding across a number of areas, or they're just looking for general support and they're not entirely sure what they want to be doing, a generalist agency is very beneficial for that. But if you have a very, very nicely scoped brief around a specific channel, for sure a generalist agency is not the best place to go. So that's one that I would certainly zoom in on. There is certainly resonating with yours.
Yeah, for sure. And it is a two-way door, right? You help out agencies, but also help out businesses as well, right? Are there any things to look out for from your perspective when an agency is talking with a client to make sure that it's a good fit for the agency?
That's interesting. So that is something that we've had to hone our business on a lot this year. So, Vendry only started October of last year, and I've only been doing this full time for about 8 months. So we've had a lot of learning as a business, not just as a matching service, but like how do we make money and how do we optimize our business? And one thing that we've really come to the conclusion of is, our inability to vet clients up front ultimately creates friction for agencies. So I would say to our agency partners, that is a service that we try and offer, in that, we want to bring them leads that are of a certain caliber, so that when they do invest time in providing those clients information up front, there is some payoff on the back end. But from an agency standpoint, when looking at clients, clarity around budget. So we get a lot of, okay, we're not sure how much we're willing to spend. I'd love for the agency to submit something. And that's a little scary because ideally you want a client that has already at least buffered a certain budget into their P&L so that they know what they're comfortable with. So my comeback to that or my retort to the client is like, what is a number that scares you? Right? Like if I said, okay, like here's the budget X amount, like what's going to make you a little skittish? And so we tend to use that as the budget if we can provide that. So that's a really big one. And the second thing on the client side, and then I actually have a few more for clients looking at agencies is, a client not necessarily knowing what they want. Because ultimately, from an agency standpoint, if you don't have a counterpart on the client side that is going to be collaborative and support you, you're looking at a very short-term relationship off the front, right? Like as an agency, you want a client that if things aren't going well, which a lot of times they don't, right? Like there's this notion that an agency is going to be a sort of magic spell for turning things around. And the reality is, even the best agencies can't make things work sometimes. But having a client that as an agency you feel like you can collaborate with, and if it is a little bit challenging and you need some resources internally or you need some advocacy, they'll be willing to do that for you.
Yeah, I think, one thing I saw somebody put on Twitter, I can't remember who it was, but it was that agencies amplify your existing business. So either positive or negative, right? And that's where, from the agency perspective, it can be very beneficial if you provide a service that is performance-based to run an audit or at least look into their numbers, understand their P&L, and make sure that what you can provide can bring them profitability. Are they going to spend enough to break even, including your cost and the ad spend, to where they could be profitable? Is what you're providing even what they need? And you kind of touched on this a little bit, but from the Facebook ad perspective, there's many times in the sales process where you see, maybe it's their website that needs attention first, or maybe it's their actual product offering or just overall brand messaging that needs help. And a Facebook ad agency isn't going to fix that. And if they don't address that, it's going to be a 2 to 3 month partnership maximum.
Yeah, exactly. And there's kind of this notion too of like, okay, what is the best agency, or, what is the perfect fit? And the reality is that doesn't exist. At least we've yet to find it. Maybe there is like a secret agency that we aren't working with yet. But the reality is it's finding the right agency. And even the right agency sometimes doesn't work out. And so it's like that acceptance that there is a risk tolerance there. That's something that I think clients need to be comfortable with. And it's the same risk you inherit bringing something in-house, right? You hire employees and humans are inherently flawed. And you could bring in a great A player and ultimately it doesn't net the results you want. So it's being comfortable with, okay, let's find the right agency. And I think like working with a service like Vendry or taking the time to run a more thoughtful process where you are engaging more agencies, we're not guaranteeing you're going to find an agency that's going to move the needle, but I think we give you a higher probability of doing that, right? And that's ultimately what we are here to do, is give you a better chance of ultimately being successful, because there's no guarantees in business. I think we've all sort of come to peace with that.
And if an agency, there's another bonus one for you. If an agency offers that, that's normally another red flag for you there. And I think you said you had additional things for businesses or brands to think about when they were looking at agencies. Yeah,
so I'll throw one more out there. I do think it's useful to judge a book by its cover when it comes to agencies. So this isn't like a hard and fast rule where it's always necessarily true, but these are the people that are ultimately going to be developing consumer-facing marketing for you, whether you're a B2B business or B2C. And so the agency's ability to market themselves should be a reflection of the work they do, because ultimately their own brand is their first client. And so if you go to an agency's website and they can't clearly articulate the value that they do or the results that they've driven, or it doesn't give you confidence that they're going to be successful, that is a very reasonable red flag. And so I would say it's okay to be a little bit shallow when it comes to assessing agencies. There are thousands and thousands of agencies across North America. And so if you need to cut out a few from your search just by saying, hey, they are not doing a great job of marketing themselves, that is totally reasonable.
No, that's actually a really good call out. And when you talk about articulating value and articulating what they do, I think one thing that is very beneficial in the sales process for agencies to do and can help the client out a lot is pitch it in terms of project timelines. So, of course, you're going to be looking at the services that you provide and things like that. But from my perspective, to sell a non-tangible to someone that doesn't understand fully the execution or the thought behind the execution, mapping it out in terms of timelines can help them wrap their head around what they're going to get, when they're going to get it, and what they should expect from it as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I think clients very much value that because ultimately we're all beholden to someone. And so when a client needs to bring that back to, an executive sponsor that's ultimately going to sign off the project, having that to lean back on and say, okay, here's when we can potentially expect results. Here's when we're going to start hitting milestone A, B, and C. That does go a very, very long way in helping them make that decision.
Yeah, 100%. And what would you say some of the biggest opportunities are for Vendry looking ahead at the year 2024?
So I think the biggest thing for us, I really do feel like we spent a lot of time this year validating our business, operationally becoming a lot stronger and building agency relationships that we're confident in and we can now leverage time and time again. For us, when speaking to brands and clients, where we really want to invest our time is education. And that education is around the notion that you don't need to be running a search on your own, right? For folks listening, some of you, this might be the first you've ever heard of handing off an agency search, right? And it might create skepticism in your mind. For some of you, that might be empowering and a weight off your shoulders. And so I would wager, I don't have data on this, but I would wager 99% of clients are still running agency searches on their own because services like Vendry have not existed in the past. And so what we really want to spend this year doing is letting clients know there is an opportunity to find amazing agencies through us at no cost to them, while still ensuring that they're getting a really, really great relationship or service provider on the back end. We want to alleviate that as much as possible because having sat in their shoes, it is very, very time consuming to do. So I think that's going to be the biggest theme for us next year. And just continuing to build the right dialogue around what we're doing. So we have a newsletter, case studied, which every week we go through a really, really cool case study that covers off a campaign that, typically involves an agency helping support a brand reach new heights. Potentially there's expansion into other media categories. But yeah, just all kind of playing in that theme and seeing how far we can take it.
Yeah, I think hiring and revenue are two things all agencies talk about. And I think those are two things that are very crucial and can be difficult for brands or just businesses as well. And that hiring piece, you can always bring somebody in-house, but there's so much implied time on onboarding and training and all of that management versus, of course I'm biased, but having an agency that has an onboarding process and can get you up to speed a lot quicker and can hopefully get you in the direction that you're going for. And a lot of D2C brands, at least, when you hear about them growing and growing very quickly, stay lean by working with agencies versus bringing in-house staff or team that way as well.
Yeah. I've gone back and forth a lot actually in my career on like in-house versus agency, and I still don't think it's like one or the other. For me, I was actually chatting with a brand the other day, and they needed to essentially determine, okay, can we turn around our performance marketing really quickly? And the decision was, do we bring on like a director level of marketing that can change the culture and improve performance marketing and get their CAC down significantly? Or the alternative is bringing on an agency. And to your point, like if you're bringing on an internal hire, you're probably looking at 2 months to hire, on board and get them up to speed, then another couple months to change culture, and then another couple months to drive results. Mm-hmm. Whereas if they brought on an agency like you guys, you're onboarding them in 2 to 4 weeks and ads are in market within the first month. Mm-hmm. And so, there's obviously benefit to doing it in-house. You get to capture a lot more learning and, there are potentially economies of scale as you grow. But I do think for a lot of brands to stay lean, which is really, really needed in this financial climate, the decision towards agency does feel like there is a lot more of a pull there.
For sure. And Dan, if you had to summarize everything we've discussed today into a marketing mindset, what mindset should agencies, well, let me ask this one directional. What mindset should businesses have when it comes to hiring an agency?
I think it's apply the same mindset you would to bringing an employee to bringing on an agency. I think we put so much more stock as marketing leaders into bringing on employees because there is a much bigger investment in that relationship, right? You're handing someone a job, and so I understand why that does feel a lot more emotional. But when you're working with an agency and you make that decision to bring on an agency partner, don't discount how important the investment is in that relationship, both upfront and running a really, really thoughtful agency search process, but secondly, nurturing that relationship, creating accountability, and ultimately growing together. Because if it is successful, I do believe agencies can have outsized growth relative to really, really great employees, or at least similar. And so why wouldn't you treat them with the same kindness, investment, and care that you would bringing on an in-house team?
Yeah. So anyone listening, you work with an agency, send them a Christmas card, send them the bonuses, send them those things. But I'm excited to ask you this one right here, because you see people hiring. So you see the data behind percentages of what's the focus. For anyone listening that's at the stage of figuring out what they'd like to do in the marketing industry, what marketing role or roles do you think will have the highest demand in the next 3 to 5 years?
Oh, that's a really, really tough one. I don't think it's shifting as transformatively as we might believe. I still see Facebook and Google being the leaders when it comes to media spend. And so the need for creative, which has sort of shifted in the last, say, like 2 to 3 years, a bigger shift away from media buying practices to creative. That still feels like it will be true in 3 to 5 years. But I do think there is a really big shift happening to more native social, specifically around user-generated content, both on TikTok, YouTube, Instagram Reels. Some of those algorithms that like propelled brands in the early 2010s, before Instagram turned off the tap and made it harder for your brand to be discovered, those taps are turning back on, right? There's a ton of discoverability through TikTok now, and YouTube has some discoverability built into it as well. And so I think like as these platforms are tuning their algorithms to enable good content to flourish, not just with your existing audience, but a new audience too, I do see more and more brands starting to invest in those areas from a content creation standpoint and channel management standpoint as well.
Yeah, creative has become definitely the talk of the D2C Twitter space, and just a lot of agencies are shifting focus towards creative and creative strategy. So, Dan, tell us, where can listeners connect with you and learn more about your business?
Yeah, so if you're looking to get help with an agency search, check out Vendry. So that's vendry.io. And we can kick off a search. If you go through our search process, you'll get kicked into a Calendly. That is my calendar. So if you want to book some time, that's the best place to do so. You can also find me on Twitter at Growing Gray, or on LinkedIn, just under Dan Gray there. But yeah, open to helping any brands we can, even if folks want some support or just spitballing ideas around who are the right agencies to bring in to the fold next year. Please reach out. We get so much exposure to what clients are doing and what agencies are succeeding at. So more than happy to connect with folks and provide as much insight as we can.
Well, Dan, good chat today on hiring. I appreciate you coming on board for the podcast. Thanks for sharing everything.
Yeah, my pleasure. Appreciate you having me.